Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. Joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris. Described by the late Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David has led AJC since 1990. 53 years ago this week, the Six-Day War broke out. While some wars fade into obscurity, this one remains as relevant today as it was in 1967, and much of its aftermath remains unresolved. Today, David will share his perspective on this historic event and why it still matters 53 years later. Moderating this conversation is David's Chief of Staff, Bel Yoeli. After we hear from David, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Bel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and welcome to all of our viewers. It's great to be with you. And of course, David, it's good to be with you. We have a lot to cover and many questions, so we're just gonna jump right in. David, you've said many times, and you still do today, that the Six-Day War, which took place 53 years ago, starting today, June 5, still matters. Why?
Thank you, Bel, and hello to everyone. Yes, it still matters 53 years later, and for two principal reasons, I believe. The first is that on June 5th, 1967, there were no settlements. There was Israel. The war was intended to destroy Israel. And it's important for people to understand and remember that fact because it's embedded in the Israeli psyche. This was a war whose intention was to destroy the state of Israel. And the second reason is because when we speak about the West Bank and we speak about Gaza and we speak about settlements and borders and security barriers and the status of Jerusalem, etc., all of these issues today derive from the outcome of the war 53 years ago. So anyone who wants to discuss possible solutions or pathways forward needs to understand where this began, because without that understanding, they're operating in a vacuum.
That makes a lot of sense. Learning from history so we can understand the situation today. I think that applies to a lot of what we discuss at AJC.
But unfortunately, we live in a largely ahistorical world where it doesn't have to be the Six-Day War, but you mention history and people begin to roll their eyes and you can feel you're losing their attention rapidly. But without a return to history, how can one intelligently discuss the situation today, at least with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Absolutely. So David, set the scene for us. You know, what was the situation on the ground between the rebirth of the State of Israel in 1948 and the War of Independence up until June 1967? You know, what were Israel's borders? Who was in charge of what? Which I think a lot of people don't fully understand, particularly including the West Bank and Gaza and those borders.
Sure. So let's dial back to November 1947. The British were still in charge of the mandate that had been given to them by the League of Nations some 25 years earlier. It was clear the mandate was going to come to an end. The United Nations knew that there would be this festering issue of what to do with this sliver of land. And so they created the UN Special Committee on Palestine, known by its acronym UNSCOP, to go to the region, to study, and to offer possible solutions. They came back with a solution, and the solution was a two-state agreement, a Jewish state and an Arab state. This is their terminology, not mine, with the status of Jerusalem to be left as an international city. that was then submitted to the UN General Assembly as a recommendation. It was not binding, it was a recommendation. And that was debated, and in November 1947, the UN General Assembly, by a vote of 33 nations in favor of the recommendation, 13 opposed, and 10 abstentions, endorsed the recommendation. So again, November 1947. The British mandate was going to run out on May 14th, 1948, so some 6 months later. The Jewish side of the equation indicated that they would go forward and proceed to announce the creation or the rebirth of a nation. By the way, no one knew what its name would be. Some speculated it could be Judea, others Israel, but no one knew. The Arab side of the equation rejected forcefully the November resolution of the UN General Assembly and said, we're not in a spirit of compromise. From our perspective, this is stolen land. So when Israel was announced on May 14th by David Ben-Gurion and the name was revealed, Israel, war was declared immediately by the Arab world. Now, there was no surprise there because there had been a kind of hybrid war going on through all those months before the May 14th, May 15th declaration. So this was Israel's war of independence from day one. The outcome of the war was a series of armistice agreements. And this is important as well, because when people speak, for example, about the Palestinian return to their land or a restoration of Palestinian statehood, there never was a Palestinian state. What happened instead was a series of armistice agreements, principally between Israel and Jordan, which delineated the West Bank as an armistice line. An armistice line is not a peace treaty. It's a temporary cessation of conflict with an agreement by both sides that will respect this line, or we should, until there's a formal agreement. With Syria, there was not an armistice agreement, so there was in a way, a continuation of the war without necessarily weapons, and on it went. But at the end of the war, Israel had sort of expanded the territory that had been given it by the UN. It was in Western Jerusalem. And so you had from 1948 to 1967 or 1949, you had a line with Syria, which was not the result of a peace treaty. You had the West Bank in Jordanian hands, and this is important, including the eastern half of Jerusalem. And Jordan, during this period till 1967, annexed, I use the word very carefully, formally annexed the West Bank into Jordan. Egypt controlled Gaza, and it imposed a military rule on Gaza, which was pretty draconian. It did not give people in Gaza much room for maneuver or exit or development. So this was sort of the basic construct on the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967.
And David, just to further clarify for our viewers, that delineation, that separation between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, that was the status of Jerusalem when the Six-Day War broke out.
Correct. And that was the result of, again, of the Armistice Agreement. By the way, the Armistice Agreement also included very specific provisions, Bill, not just on borders, but in this case, on access. So for the Jews, for Israel, what was important in particular was access to the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem and to the Kotel, or what we call the Western Wall. That was enshrined in the Armistice Agreement. The problem was that in this case, Jordan did not respect and protect the access of Jews to those holy sites. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, several dozen synagogues in the old city were desecrated, if not destroyed, under Jordanian rule. Jews were not allowed any access whatsoever to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. So while there was this Armistice Agreement that provided for access, in reality, no access was provided at all, and Jewish sites were trampled on and denied access to Jewish worshippers.
David, you mentioned obviously the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians. Another key player in this story is the Palestinians. And I'm curious, particularly in terms of Palestinian leadership and what that looked like at the time. When was the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, created? Was that before or after the Six-Day War? And why is that significant in this story?
Well, it is significant because the PLO was actually established in 1964, meaning 3 years before the Six-Day War. So why is it important? Because if people today focus on the issue of settlements and believe that that's the center of the conflict, then what was the center of the conflict in 1964 when there were no settlements? The PLO was established, but in reality, the PLO saw all of Israel, if you will, as a settlement. And let me read you, if I may, just a sentence or two from Article 15 of the PLO Charter, which was established in 1964. Quote, "The liberation of Palestine from an Arab viewpoint is a national duty to repulse the Zionist imperialist invasion from the great Arab homeland and to purge the Zionist presence from Palestine." To purge the Zionist presence from Palestine. So the original intent of the PLO was not to negotiate a two-state agreement. Rather, it was to purge the Zionist existence from Palestine. And why is that important? Because to this day, there is still a healthy debate as to whether the PLO has actually moved on, truly moved on from those words, or only superficially moved on from those words, but in reality clings to that original goal of what they viewed at the time as an invasion, as modern-day crusaders, the Jews coming and needing to be repulsed, just as the earlier Christian crusaders were repulsed centuries before by Saladin and the Muslim forces that he assembled.
Yeah, when you read that line, obviously I had a ping in my gut because it reminds me of language that is, as you said, is still used today by certain Palestinian factions. David, I want to take us specifically now into the Six-Day War, and obviously there have been dozens of books written on this war alone. Was this a war of aggression, as some assert, or was it a war of self-defense? Because Israel did initiate an attack on June 5th, 1967. So clarify that for us.
So first of all, you mentioned books, and I don't get any commission, but I think most people will agree today that the single most authoritative book is 6 Days of War by Dr. Michael Oren, who subsequently became Israel's ambassador to the United States and is now back in Israel. So for people who want much more content, read the book. But in brief, the war didn't begin out of context. There was a specific context, Bill, and it began certainly several weeks earlier. So for example, on May the 16th, Cairo Radio, let me again, if I may read, Cairo Radio announced publicly on May 16th, "The existence of Israel has continued too long. The battle has come in which we shall destroy Israel." On May 27th, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, said, quote, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel." On June the 1st, Iraq's leader added, "We are resolved, determined, and united to achieve our clear aim of wiping Israel off the map." And on June the 3rd, 2 days before the start of the war, Cairo Radio hailed the impending Muslim holy war. So what we all wanted to believe was a political geographic war, they were framing in holy religious terms. Now, that's one threat. And Israel, which was 19 years old at the time, remember, established in 1948, Israel, which was just 22 years away from the end of the Holocaust, and the central lesson of the Holocaust was that when, in the build-up to the Second World War, Adolf Hitler declared his intention to destroy the Jewish people, not enough people took it seriously. People kind of dismissed Mein Kampf. Well, you know, when Hitler becomes chancellor, he's going to have to collect the mail and pick up the garbage, and that's going to moderate him. So think of the Israeli mindset. Blood-curdling threats to annihilate the Jewish people 22 years after the Holocaust, 19 years after this fragile state was established. And look at the map, because this is critical too. Until the war, that is on the eve of the Six-Day War, the narrowest point of Israel, the narrowest point was 9 miles wide. That was the area around Kfar Saba, for those who might be familiar with the geography of Israel. 9 miles wide, and that was close to the center of Israel. Meaning that if an Arab invasion cut Israel in half, it would make it strategically that much more difficult, if not impossible, for Israel to defend itself. In fact, fast forward a number of years, Bill, George W. Bush is governor of Texas. He visits Israel. Ariel Sharon hosts him, takes him on a helicopter ride, and shows him, among other sights from the air, this narrow point of 9 miles. George Bush is reported to have responded by saying, there are some driveways in Texas that are longer than Israel is wide. That's how fragile it was. In addition, and Michael Oren speaks about this in his book, the Soviets were very unhelpful here. They apparently were spreading rumors and misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of stuff, telling the Arabs to kind of, get ready because war is coming, Israel is on the march, and all the rest. So yes, on June 5th, Israel, surrounded by this threat of war, Jordan having submitted its forces to the control of Egypt and Syria, Iraq calling for the extinction of Israel, the Soviets playing a meddlesome role, Israel, this narrow, fragile state without much strategic depth, launched a war of self-defense. I can only call it a war of self-defense. A war of aggression is when you want to acquire someone else's land. A war of self-defense is when you want to defend yourself against people who publicly call for your annihilation. Again, 22 years after the Holocaust, which was so deeply embedded in the psyche of Israel. And then there was one other pathway, Bell, that we also need to cite. And that was how the international community responded to those events in the buildup. So on the one hand, here's the Arab world, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, etc. Here's the Israeli mindset on the second hand. And then there's the third hand. Could Israel count on the international community to prevent war? And the answer in the end was no. And the reasons were a couple. First, on that same day, May 16th, when Cairo Radio first called for the annihilation of Israel, Egypt called on the United Nations to withdraw the UN peacekeeping forces, both in Gaza and in Sharm el-Sheikh. Sharm el-Sheikh is the southernmost tip of the Red Sea, which provides access for Israeli shipping. The UN, to its everlasting shame, not only did not consult with Israel, but agreed to the Egyptian request, and 3 days later, May 19th, began the withdrawal of those peacekeeping forces. Then came the second Egyptian step. Again, feeling that the international community would not stop them, the next step was a naval blockade of the Straits of Tiran, Sharm el-Sheikh, meaning that no Israeli shipping could go from the port of Eilat through the Red Sea and on to Asia and Africa. In international relations, that kind of naval blockade is what's called a casus belli, a Latin term for a cause for war. So Israel looks and sees the UN is not going to be helpful. Even the United States, by then Israel's best friend, is not stepping in to stop the Arab world. And France, which had been Israel's principal ally, partner, and strategic arms supplier, by then had reversed itself under President de Gaulle and declared a boycott of weapons to Israel. That was the surrounding environment in which Israeli decision makers had to say, if we launch the attack first, there will always be those who say we started a war. But if we don't, we might not have time to recover and defend these fragile borders. And so on June 5th, they launched a war of self-defense.
Thank you, David. And I'm still struck by that very powerful parallel between World War II and Jewish perception and reaction to Hitler's action and perceived threats later on in Israeli history. And as we know, that still plays out today and is very much a part of the Israeli mentality that I think we both would agree is very often misunderstood still to this day.
Look, Bella, as a decades-long student of international relations, you don't have to agree with the other side, and you have your own point of view, obviously. But you need to understand the psyche, the mindset, the factors that shape the other side. So we, AJC, I have tried also to understand the psyche and the mindset of the Palestinians, of the larger Arab world. Not necessarily because I agree with everything they say, but without that understanding of the other side, there's no ability on the one hand to prepare for war, God forbid, but no less importantly, to try and identify the pathway to peace without understanding what makes them tick. And this reference to annihilation of Israel struck such a psychological and historical chord that it was impossible. It was impossible to draw any other conclusion than, oh my gosh, first it was Hitler, now they want to complete the job.
It's a very important point. David, I want to ask you, we spoke about the Palestinians, we spoke about the international community and France. Obviously during the war, Egypt and Syria were the frontline Arab states. What was the specific case with Jordan?
So this is really interesting as well, because in a way, Jordan has always been a very different country from Israel's perspective. There was always with Jordan, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken, but there was always a kind of understanding that Jordan and Israel, in their own way, needed each other. Jordan was not Egypt, it was not Syria, it was not Iraq, it was not a bellicose nation in the way that they were. And there are reasons for it. First of all, Israel and Jordan shared a long border. But most importantly is the fact that Jordan has a very substantial Palestinian population. Again, I don't know the exact number because it all depends on whose statistics you rely on. But certainly over half of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. So there's always been this awareness in the Hashemite kingdom, which is essentially a Bedouin Hashemite kingdom, that without full control, one day Palestinian irredentism not only can turn toward Israel, but also towards Jordan. So what happens in the West Bank between Israel and Jordan matters not only to Israel, it obviously does, it matters very consequentially to Jordan. And so interestingly enough, Bell, to fast forward in the mid-1990s, AJC hosted Crown Prince Hassan. Now, Crown Prince was the brother of King Hussein, the longtime and very much admired leader of Jordan. He brought us a coffee table-sized book of Jordan, a beautiful book. And I remember opening it and being shocked because the first 2 pages were a map of Jordan. And the map showed the entire West Bank as an integral part of Jordan. There were no dotted lines. It was simply incorporated into Jordan, even though, number one, it was under Israeli rule since 1967. And even though, number two, in the 1990s, the whole discussion, including with Oslo, was the creation of an independent Palestinian state. And yet Jordan was distributing coffee table books that showed the West Bank as part of Jordan. Maybe in their own mind, aspirationally, that was their hope, because it was their way of trying to make sure that the Hashemites survived. So Israel quietly went to the Jordanians through a third party, through an intermediary, through the UN. This is all documented, and urged Jordan not to enter the war. Egypt and Syria were intent on the war. They were going forward. come hell or high water. Jordan, however, went along, and as I said, even put their own armies under the control of their neighbors. Later, much later, King Hussein admitted that this was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made. Because what he did was he lost the war. He lost control of Eastern Jerusalem, which Jordan had overseen. He lost the control of the West Bank. And what did he gain in return? A kind of humiliation as a defeated party in war. So he was I've met him when he was alive on several occasions, a very charismatic figure, very thoughtful, very wise. But he himself said, and I heard him say it, it was among my biggest mistakes.
Right. Thank you, David. So obviously we can't talk about every detail of the 6-day war because that would take hours and hours, and we're not warfare experts. But we get to the end of the war. Israel, 6 days later, has this incredible, decisive victory. What happened next? I mean, you talked about what Jordan ended up with in the end. Was there a chance for some kind of peace offering by Israel? What happened at the end of the war?
So first of all, you can imagine that in Israel, this victory was seen not just in military or political terms, but frankly, it was seen in religious and redemptive terms. That this miraculous victory of this tiny nation against the assemblage of Arab armies in just 6 days, and the extension of its borders, including the capture of Eastern Jerusalem, and especially the Kotel and the Temple Mount. And for those who listened to Yossi Klein Halevi on another AJC call a few days ago, he spoke very movingly, very graphically about what that meant for the first soldiers to be able to declare the Temple Mount is in our hands, the Western Wall is in our hands. So there was this kind of headiness. It was almost impossible to believe. But then Israel suddenly believed that it had something now to negotiate with the Arab world. Until the 6-day war, what could they negotiate about? What did they have to offer? Only their own tiny borders. And they were not going to give up their borders for the sake of some kind of possible illusion of peace. But now they had territory. Now they had the Sinai. Now they had the West Bank. Now they had the Golan Heights. Now they had something to negotiate with. So from that point forward was introduced the language called land for peace. The Israeli concept being, we've now acquired this land in a war of self-defense. Can we exchange it for the peace that escaped us from 1948 to 1967? The one condition for Israel, and it was pretty much a universal condition, was we will not give back the old quarter of Jerusalem, the Jewish quarter. We will not negotiate over the future of the Kotel. Together with the Temple Mount, these are the holiest sites of the Jewish people. We were denied access, but other than that, we're open to negotiation on the basis of land for peace. And by the way, I would just add, again, as a student of history and international relations, the nation victorious in war has usually acquired land as a consequence. I mean, there are consequences for creating a war, for calling for the annihilation of another country. So wars don't just end and the victorious targeted nation simply says, let's go back to the status quo ante, here's your land back, let's wipe the slate clean and start all over again. So Israel formulated this land for peace with the modifications of Jerusalem, and it was formally considered by the Arab League, which met in Sudan, in Khartoum, Sudan's capital. And on September the 1st, 1967, the Arab League response came loud and clear to Israel's offer for land for peace. And it became known as the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. That could have been an opportunity, Bell, for the beginning of a serious peace process. But at that time, the Arab world still felt Israel had no rightful place. The Jews were not indigenous. They were seen as outsiders or crusaders, as I said earlier. And to understand the Arab psyche, they were not prepared to negotiate based on a humiliating military defeat. So it's interesting, if I can just fast forward for a moment, to the 73 war, 6 years later, where, again, we don't have the time to go into all the details, but here's the relevant point. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur. They caught Israel by surprise. They pushed Israel back in the early days. Questions were raised about, could Israel survive? Could it recoup? Would it have enough spare parts to carry on a longer war than anticipated? In the end, of course, with heavy casualties, Israel won the war. But Egypt had regained some of its dignity by catching Israel by surprise and by inflicting damage. So if people go to Cairo even today, the museum to the 73 war is a museum about the victory of Egypt, not the defeat. But for Anwar Sadat, who was the Egyptian leader in 73, Gamal Abdel Nasser was the leader in 67. For Sadat, that was enough restored dignity to be able to explore the possibilities for peace quietly with Israel, first in places like Romania and Morocco, and then eventually in 1977, to make that historic trip to Jerusalem as a proud Egyptian leader, as one who witnessed the victory in the 73 war, not the defeat in the 67 war. And that, of course, launched the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations, which led to the historic peace treaty in 79, and which is held to the present day.
David, going back to the time again, rewinding once more to around the 6-Day War, I know that there was another story happening that was, near and dear to your heart that wasn't getting as much attention coming from the Arab world in Libya, in particular with the Jewish community. Can you talk about that?
I can, and quite personally, not through my own experience, but through the experience of my wife. My wife is one of 8 children, born in Tripoli, Libya. Their family had lived in Libya for centuries. On her father's side, the family believes they came with the Romans, so roughly 2,000 years ago, when the Jews were used as labor in the whole Mediterranean region, the Roman Empire. And her mother's family came as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. Her mother's family's maiden name was Suarez de la Peña. But both sides met and for centuries lived in Libya. The 6-Day War was traumatic for the Jewish community of Libya, and not only in Libya. But it's a story I know best because my wife was 16 years old at the time, 16, the second oldest of the siblings. And she still remembers the news reports from Libyan radio and the news reports from Cairo. Nasser's voice, we are on the verge of victory. The Israelis are running backwards like cowards with their heads between their legs. The whole story was a lie. It was a lie to feed the belief in the Arab world, in this case in Libya, that the great Arab armies were inflicting a humiliating defeat on Israel. And this created, again, a kind of sense of ecstasy in the streets of Tripoli and Misrata and Benghazi. And the result, in part, was, we want to partake in this victory as well. Let's go find the Jews. So the Arab armies found the Israeli Jews. Let's go find the local Jews. And the result of this horrific story were a series of pogroms in the streets and homes of Tripoli, where my wife's family was living and cowering and hiding. A number of people murdered simply for the fact of being Jews. My wife's family's very modest house being surrounded by a mob that she describes of up to 200 or 300 people carrying torches and wanting to light on fire their house with 10 people, 8 children and 2 parents hiding in the house. I have to add, though, one important story, because they would have been murdered, but for one person, a Libyan Arab, who had the enormous courage to stand up and face the mob and say to the mob, leave this family alone, they are a good family. And for whatever reason, Bell, I don't know, the mob moved on. So my wife's family was saved, but other families were not saved as a result. This person helped arrange for these 10 people to go into hiding for several weeks before they were given safe passage out of the country, and of course, never to return. So what was once a long-standing, proud Jewish community was reduced to zero. There are no Jews left in Libya today, not one. There is no trace of the Jewish life, of the synagogues and the tombstones and everything else that made up this vibrant Jewish life. So when we speak about refugees from the conflict, what we hear in the media and in the universities and in the United Nations always tends to be Palestinian refugees. That is one question. It's a very important question that needs to have answers. But there was a second question. The Jews of Libya and the other Jews in other Arab countries who were targeted with their own annihilation, with the pogroms, who were forced to leave their homes, forced to leave their properties behind, forced to leave whatever savings they had behind, forced to leave the gravestones of their ancestors behind. And it took an enormous emotional toll. The obvious difference in the end, those Jews either resettled in Italy or in Israel or in France or in Canada or in Brazil or in Panama, and they moved on. Whatever their bitterness was, they moved on. They weren't instrumentalized. They weren't put in refugee camps generation after generation. They weren't held up as a kind of political prop to say, look at what was done to us. Yes, a lot was done to them as it was done to the Palestinians, but one side chose to move on and resolve the issues as best they could. The other side has prolonged the refugee issue to the present day.
Obviously a very powerful story, David, that I think really helps set the context that, again, a lot of people don't understand in terms of the competing issues and priorities, as you mentioned. I want to ask one more question and then try to move toward the many, many, many audience questions that we're getting as I see.
Sorry for the long answers, but this is complicated stuff.
Not at all. So you mentioned earlier in the story the French-Israeli relationship and how France had been a bedrock of the Israeli defense doctrine. Given what happened, what was the shift after the Six-Day War with France? And along the same lines, what happened with U.S.-Israel relations? I feel like that was probably a turning point. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bill. It was a major turning point in the strategic doctrine of the State of Israel. Because as you said, really until 1967, the backbone of the Israeli military was French weaponry, including French aircraft. I mean, when Israel on day one went to Egypt, went to Syria, it was overwhelmingly in French aircraft. But by then, France had already imposed an embargo on any new transfers of equipment or supplies. And why France turned around in those months leading up to the Six-Day War and really completed the turnaround during and after the Six-Day War is largely seen as a function of its renewed interest in the Arab world. It had lost Algeria. Algeria was a major French territory. There was a brutal civil war from, I think, 1954 to 1962, 8 years. If I'm not mistaken, there were well over 1 million people killed in that civil war in which France was centrally involved. Lord knows how many people were displaced. Lord knows how many people became refugees and, by the way, moved to France and elsewhere. So while France was a colonial power, it had one set of interests in which Israel figured rather prominently. But once it became a post-colonial power, it had a profound interest in deepening its relations with these newly independent countries And then it was a zero-sum game in the French mind. If we deepen our relations with Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, it means at the expense of Israel. We don't see it as being able to juggle both. So there was the turnaround by Charles de Gaulle, who was then the president, the legendary figure, wartime figure, Charles de Gaulle. So Israel lost France. But Israel had begun in the 60s to gain the serious attention of the United States. Let's remember, Harry Truman was a hero in 1948 in extending recognition of Israel's independence, but he imposed an arms embargo from day one. So there were no American weapons going to Israel from 1948 on. That was only changed 14 years later, initially by John Kennedy. But Lyndon Johnson is really the hero of this story. Johnson became president in '63 after the assassination of John Kennedy on November 22nd. He remained president until January 20th, 1969. Johnson was a huge friend of Israel, a huge friend of the Jewish people, and had been quite outspoken, by the way, during the Holocaust about American policy. He's the one who began the major arms sales. He's the one who began to forge the serious strategic partnership between the US and Israel, which fast forward now 50 plus years, really began in the decade of the 60s as France moved out, as John Kennedy opened the door, but as Lyndon Johnson in his big classic way strode through the door and never looked back.
Thank you, David, for explaining that really important piece of the story. I'm going to move toward our audience questions, and I will do our best to our viewers to try to get to these. I'm going to try and combine a few of them. Our first couple of questions have to do with the impact of the war on Jewish identity in different places. So Tammy in actually Sofia, Bulgaria, is asking, you spoke in another AJC session about the war's impact on Jewish identity behind the Iron Curtain. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And Lisa in New Jersey wants to know the impact of the war on American Jews and their experience and identity.
Oh, great. And I assume Tammy is probably Tamara, shortening her name for an American audience. So she may have been, I don't know what age she is, but she may have been part of that story as well behind the Iron Curtain. But think of it this way. The Arab world in '67 was in some respects a proxy for the Soviet Union. And it relied very heavily on Soviet weaponry. So while the war was between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, etc., the weaponry used, the intelligence gathering, the strategic doctrine were largely informed on the Arab side by the Soviets, not entirely, but by the Soviets. For Soviet Jews, the idea that the Jewish people, 22 years after the Shoah, a people who during the Shoah, with few exceptions, were unable to defend themselves, not only defended themselves in this brilliant military victory, which every military academy on the planet, I believe, studies to this day. Whether they're friends of Israel or not doesn't matter, but they study what happened during that war, that this sliver of land, this remnant of a people, was able to defeat not only the Arab armies, but the Soviet weaponry, which Soviet citizens had been told time and again was superior to American weaponry. This was seen in terms of miracles. And if there were a way of measuring it, and I started going to the Soviet Union a few years later, and I saw it even several years later, the sense of pride. Being a Jew is not a shame, it's not a stigma. The Soviet Union has always tried to tell me that I have to hide my Jewishness. You know, I have to pretend that I don't look Jewish, or whatever the perception of looking Jewish might mean. I had to lay low. I had to be meek in order to survive in the Soviet Union. And darn it, look at those Israelis. They make me walk taller and prouder. And you know what? I want to know more about Israel. And you know what? Maybe one day, if miracles continue to happen, I might go and live in Israel. And among American Jews, it was very much the same thing. Obviously, it was not the Cold War. Obviously, it was not about weaponry. But that war made many American Jews, I was 18 at the time, walk differently, talk differently. This was a war of survival. The threat was a threat of destruction and annihilation, a second Shoah. In 6 days, Israel had performed in a way that no other army had ever done. The same people who couldn't fight historically. So the sense of pride and new energy and new outlook, I think, was enormously contagious in the Jewish world, behind the Iron Curtain, in the United States, and elsewhere in the diaspora.
Thank you, David.
And you were too young and you missed it.
I missed too many good things that happened in the past. I can't focus on that. It's too depressing. Yosef in Brussels says and writes, you spoke very beautifully about the historic moment with Egypt and how peace came about with Egypt and the very interesting context into how that came about. Can you speak about the similar developments with Jordan and how that peace process came about?
Well, absolutely. So again, just to recap, with Egypt, let's remember Anwar Sadat, who replaced Nasser, was not a Zionist. If you look back in Anwar Sadat's history, there was a flirtation with the Nazis, with Hitlerism, certainly with anti-Semitism. He had led the Egyptian army in the 73 war, so his intent was to inflict damage, destruction on Israel. But to his great credit, after the restoration of dignity as he saw it in the Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat understood that his goal as president must be the construction of Egypt and not the destruction of Israel. That the challenges within the borders of Egypt were such, a high demographic rate, many young people coming out of schools and universities looking for jobs, not necessarily finding jobs, fulfilling jobs, that he wanted to end this draining conflict with Israel and focus on rebuilding and rebuilding Egypt. In the case of Jordan, again, there was this kind of quiet understanding. There were many points of contact that were below the radar between between Jordanian and Israeli leaders. So when that peace finally emerged in 1994, it was much less of a surprise, because it was kind of the final step in what had been an evolving process over many years. Look, I'll just give you one example, which many people on this call may not know depending on their age. 1970, so 3 years after the Six-Day War that we've been talking about, Jordan has lost the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem to Israel. So no love there. But Jordan faces an internal threat. Remember, I spoke earlier about this irredentism on the part of the Palestinians. The irredentism took the form of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, moving into Jordan, embedding themselves to a large degree in Jordan and challenging Jordanian rule. It led to what became known as Black September, September 1970. It was a war that continued through 1971. In the end, Jordan prevailed, and the PLO was kicked out of Jordan, and it moved to Lebanon. By the way, in and of itself, a story that many who try to understand this war don't even realize. That is, I repeat, Jordan kicked out the Palestinian Liberation Organization, not Israel. Jordan kicked it out after it was seen as kind of fomenting a coup d'etat against the Hashemite rule. Why do I mention this, Bell? Because who quietly helped Jordan to defend itself against the PLO and the attempt to undermine the rule of the king? Quietly was Israel. It was Israel that helped save Jordan from this threat of being toppled by the PLO. So this kind of quiet de facto cooperation continued through the years. By 1994, remember, it was after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. It was a year after the Oslo Accords, signed on the White House lawn by President Clinton, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres. Jordan finally felt, you know what, it could make public what we all knew had been private. And so came out of the closet. The peace treaty was signed on the border. Jason Isaacson from AJC traveled on behalf of AJC to represent us. It was a powerful day, and suddenly we had 2 peace treaties, both of which have endured.
Thank you, David. We're getting, I think, 50 people ask the same question from Los Angeles, New Mexico, and actually from Israel, which I think is particularly charming. A 2-part question. Given this entire perspective of history, 53 years later, 1, is peace with the Palestinians possible, Israeli-Palestinian peace? And 2, on the scale of optimism to pessimism, where are you in terms of not just the Palestinians, but the broader region and the future of Israeli-Arab cooperation?
How many hours do we have? I want to believe that peace is possible. I desperately cling to the hope that peace is possible. But I also understand that peace is an aspiration. It's not that hope is an aspiration. It's not a policy. I can't build a policy around hope. We all hope for lots of things. I think peace is possible if the Palestinian leadership is willing to reconsider its narrative. Now, I know that's a very presumptuous statement, but I say it mindful that Israel too has had to reconsider its narrative. It doesn't mean that fundamentally either side changes its core beliefs, that for the next 1,000 years, Palestinians may believe that Israelis are interlopers and they're not indigenous to the region and they simply seized land. That's their narrative. I don't agree with them, but I respect their right to have their narrative. And for many in Israel, the narrative was all the land west of the Jordan River had been promised to us 100 years ago. I'm not even speaking in biblical terms. So this is a compromise, and we pay a price for the compromise, both in security and in history. So peace can only be achieved by a fundamental reconsideration of the core narratives. How much are people prepared to compromise? If they're not, then peace becomes impossible. If children are taught the same narrative, then for the next 80 or 90 years of life expectancy, they'll carry the same narrative and they'll teach it to their children, Bill. So something has to break the pattern. And here is where I think that a lot of potential peacemakers are missing the key story. I don't doubt for a moment, and AJC has addressed these issues on multiple occasions, that you don't have to agree with every Israeli government decision. You don't have to like every Israeli leader. You can dispute this or that Israeli decision, whether on settlements or what might or might not be done on the extension of Israeli sovereign law. Those are all legitimate questions of debate and negotiation. But they're missing the other central story, that since 1947, some would say since 1937 in the Peel Commission, but since 1947, every single proposal put by Israel or by the international community or by the United States to move toward a two-state settlement, in the end, has been rejected or has been ignored by the Palestinian side. Everyone has failed to meet what the Palestinians insist are their minimalist demands. Well, there is no Israeli government that I can foresee that will ever go beyond what's already been offered. So Israel had to settle for half a loaf. It was painful. They did it. They built a remarkably prosperous and thriving state that is now among the envy of the world's nations. Will there be Palestinian leaders that do the same? Again, they may cling to their narrative. I understand that. But will they compromise as Sadat compromised, as Ben Gurion compromised, as King Hussein compromised for the interests of future generations? And the answer is, I hope, I don't know. On the optimism to pessimism scale, you know, I'm a short-term pessimist, I'm a long-term optimist, sort of generally in life. I'm old enough to remember the tears that I shed watching Anwar Sadat disembark in Jerusalem in 1977 and speak before the Knesset. It didn't matter what he said, Bell. It was the very fact that the president of Egypt had come to Jerusalem, by the way, not to Tel Aviv or to Haifa, to Jerusalem. Why? He understood the psyche of Israel. The speech was a tough speech. It was not all flowers and chocolate, but he understood the psyche. King Hussein of Jordan understood the psyche. After one crazy Jordanian guard killed several young Israeli girls across the border, King Hussein quietly went to that Israeli home. He got on his knees and he begged the forgiveness of the family. He understood the psyche. He broke through it. On the other hand, Arafat, 8 months after the Oslo Accords, and I was there at the White House for the Oslo Accords, 8 months later on May 10th, 1994 in Johannesburg, he spoke in a mosque. He thought people weren't recording it. They were. And he said to the audience, and it's on the tape, anyone can hear it, that my signing of the peace treaty was only a temporary tactic drawn from the Quran until we're in a position to defeat the Israelis. That's not the spirit of Sadat. That's not the spirit of King Hussein. That's not the spirit I heard this morning when I participated in a Shabbat service from the United Arab Emirates, where the Jewish community was not gathering clandestinely behind closed doors, but openly and proudly with the endorsement of the government of the UAE. So I've seen miracles. This is not some pie in the sky. I've seen Egypt, I've seen Jordan, I've seen the UAE, I've seen other countries reaching out to Israel quietly or openly. It can happen. It can happen, but it requires a rethinking of the core narrative and how much compromise each side is prepared to give. Israel has already shown it's prepared to give. Will the Palestinians reciprocate?
David, there are many more questions to ask you, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I want to give you the last word, and I'm sorry to our viewers, the questions we didn't get to. You've given us a lot to think about, the history, how it applies to the present. A lot of people still roll their eyes, as you mentioned, at thinking back on history and understanding why it's important. What do you say to them in your final words?
Well, I dial back to where we began. Why are we talking 53 years later in such detail about a war that has been supplanted by so many other wars in so many other parts of the world? Because history matters. If anyone is serious about talking about Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian issues, you have to go back in history. You have to look at all sides, not just your own side. You have to go back and circle around this and try and understand, because without it, all you're doing is spouting talking points today, for your side. But there was a specificity to what happened in '67, and it cast a shadow, Bell, that 53 years later, we still continue to experience. And without an understanding of why that shadow exists and how it's viewed, we're not going to make the progress that which many of us, including those of us at AJC, yearn and pray for.
Thank you so much, David. And with that, Jillian, I'm going to hand it over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Belle, and thank you, David, for sharing your perspective and providing so much historical context on this event that clearly remains so relevant today. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the important subject discussed today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter most. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue standing up for Israel here in America and around the world. Visit ajc.org/donate. It's fitting that our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature Her Excellency Dina Kawar, the Ambassador of Jordan to the United States. This program will take place on Monday, June 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. To register for this program and to stay up to date on all Advocacy Anywhere programs, please visit ajc.org/advocacyanywhere. And lastly, for the first time in AJC history, AJC will be holding a virtual global forum, which will take place during the same week we were scheduled to be together in Berlin, June 14th through 18th. This 5-day online event will feature a moving opening plenary, conversations with world leaders, spirited debates, and the high-level content you have come to expect at an AJC Global Forum. For more information and to receive updates and announcements in your inbox, please visit ajc.org/globalforum. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.